I'm delighted to introduce the speaker, Professor Luis Laganà, who will address the question of whether Malta was a place for the veneration of a mother goddess during Neolithic times. It is a topic which has brought with it many controversial issues. It is also particularly interesting for our spirituality and the arts group in terms of the combined context of art and religion, because of the rather large quantity of figurines found in different temples on the islands. Professor Luis Laganà is an associate professor at the University of Malta. He obtained his PhD in art history from Loughborough University in the UK in 2005, and he currently lectures on the arts for well-being and health. He lectured actively on the history of image making and psychoanalysis, and is also an art historian, art critic, curator, and practicing artist, specializing in modern and contemporary art history and in Jungian aesthetics, prehistoric Malta, ancient art, primitivism, and cultural tourism. So without further ado, we invite Professor Luis Laganà to deliver his lecture.
Thank you, Dr. Moore, and I am very, very pleased to meet you all here and, relate a little bit more on, perhaps some of you know already, why Malta is very rich in its ancient history, in its prehistoric heritage. First of all, the importance of prehistoric art lies in its power to reveal the social context of the life of the early inhabitants of Malta, of the Maltese Islands. It is argued that during the prehistoric past, a paradise supposedly existed in the Mediterranean where a mother goddess was worshipped. Although this hypothesis is supported by a number of female figurines found in many archaeological sites, today there is still controversy about the existence of a female deity or divinity, you can call, in ancient Europe and the Mediterranean, not just Malta. It is claimed that the goddess societies were like paradises because there was no warfare and no social hierarchy and gender discrimination. It is also suggested that the communities were gynocentric. That means women-centered, and that women had a very important role in society at that time. The hypothesis that a great mother goddess existed in prehistoric Malta was discussed by a number of scholars. Let me go to our next. Because in the 80s, because of this developing situation, even later on after the conference, another site was discovered, which is very important about this hypothesis. The first international conference on archaeology of ancient Mediterranean, it was called Archaeology and Fertility Cult in the ancient Mediterranean, not just in Malta. Although one could notice that the conference was centered on the theme of fertility, the question of whether a mother goddess existed was tackled by some of the participants. We are talking about 1985. Although, as Professor Bonanno, who was for a long time head of the archaeology, faculty of archaeology at the University of Malta. He stated in the introduction after this conference of the book he published, he said, I quote, "The field remains divided between two conflicting views, one supporting wholeheartedly the existence of a universal belief in all-pervading and all-embracing Mother Goddess, of which the fertility cult is just one, albeit important aspect, and other questioning the very basis of that theory." End of quote. More than 30 figurines were found inside the temples, and various interpretations on their use and meaning have been given during these last 30 years. Most scholars suggest that the statuettes were made for religious purposes, although not all agree, and that they represent female deities. David Trump, a British archaeologist, writes, I quote, "Whatever or whoever is being represented stands, sits, or lies at the very heart of the religion of the temples." End of quote. During the conference, most scholars agreed that the Maltese temples were used as sites for the activities of fertility cults. Scholars like Maria Gimbutas, Christina Biaggi, Veronica Wien, Eleanor Gaydon, and our Maltese, very world-renowned architect, Richard England, Professor Richard England, strongly support the hypothesis that the statuettes found in Maltese Neolithic temples represent the Great Mother Goddess, which also signifies, as you all know, Mother Earth, the Great Mother. A very, as I said earlier, important conference was held between the 2nd and 5th September of 1985 at the University of Malta, and the theme was called Archaeology and Fertility Cult in the Ancient Mediterranean. For this first conference on archaeology, the ancient Mediterranean, many renowned scholars from different parts of the world attended and delivered papers on a range of topics, which included discussions on fertility cults, the significance of figurines and their interpretations, goddesses of Neolithic period in the Mediterranean, not only Malta, and ancient religions and other related subjects. One of the most important archaeologists and prehistorians who contributed immensely during the conference was Colin Renfrew. He is very well known for his extensive publication on archaeological practices and techniques, as well as Mediterranean prehistory. His paper was about the prehistoric Maltese achievement and its interpretation. Renfrew tackled the question of whether the Maltese deity or deities associated with megalithic temples are representations of the Great Earth or the Great Mother. He referred to the thesis by Dr. Peter Uko and Mr. Andrew Fleming and considered this to be a myth. Both Uko and Fleming were against the hypothesis that a mother goddess existed in Neolithic times in the Mediterranean region. In his influential volume on prehistory, prehistoric anthropomorphic figurines, Dr. Uko proposed other uses for them, such as personal charms, dolls, spirit figurines, initiation objects, twin figures, concubines, or vehicles for sympathetic magic. I quoted from his book. There is therefore no presumption in favor of an early Neolithic Great Mother. Renfrew rebutted the idea that a Neolithic Great Mother really existed in different parts of Europe. He accepted that in Malta there were female deities, but no mother goddess.
Louis, sorry for interrupting you. I'm really sorry, but there seems to be a technical problem. We don't see the slides
Okay.
moving. So
Sorry, sorry,
let's
sorry.
try to fix.
Yes, it's my fault.
No. It's okay. Okay, now it's
Okay,
fine. Okay,
okay,
it was
okay.
really important to let you know. It would be a pity
Yes,
that
yes.
yes.
These
Okay,
are
fine.
okay. I explained here. We are still in number 8. So this is 6, and I am still in number 8. These are, more than 30 figurines. I mentioned this, and during the conference, most agreed that the Maltese temples were used as sites for fertility cults. Maria Gimbutas, you all know, and others, they worked on this hypothesis, and they presented many papers and books. I mentioned Colin Renfrew and Peter Uko and Andrew Fleming. They were against this hypothesis. So, hence Renfrew suggested that that the great figure and the little subordinate figures represented either a great human leader or a divine figure with little human people. He did not consider the possibility of the existence of a mother goddess because he concluded that there is not only one deity in the Maltese temples. So I argue that one cannot rule out the hypothesis that the temples were built to honor some kind of a female deity. Other speakers during the Malta Conference discussed and expressed their views on the hypothesis that a mother goddess cult existed in Malta and other parts of Europe. One of the leading scholars who took part in the conference and caused great controversial issues on the theme of the mother goddess was the Lithuanian archaeologist Maria Gimbutas. Her paper was entitled Images and Functions of Paleolithic and Neolithic Figurines, the Question of Terminology. She argued that fertility is only one among the goddess. Many function, and it is inaccurate to call Paleolithic and Neolithic goddesses fertility goddesses. Unfortunately, Gimbutas did not want to publish her paper in the volume I referred earlier by Professor Bonanno. The reason for this seemed to be that one of the speakers at the conference criticized her work in an unfair manner during the conference, and she published her studies in a number of books and journals. Here, one also has to consider that Gimbutas had an illustrious career as a major 20th century archaeologist and was a primary founder of modern Indo-European studies. Her model for Indo-European languages enabled her to read virtually all the archaeological literature on both sides of the Cold War split, a crucial skill since most key publications in her study area were written in Eastern European languages. So, yeah, she had connections with Harvard University in her early years in the United States. In fact, she remained in the United States until she died. She passed away. She had the opportunity to excavate places in the northern part of Europe, in Vinca, Starcevo, Sesklo cultures, and so on. She referred to the Great Mother Goddess found in Malta in her 3 best publications: The Language of the Goddess, published in 1989, The Civilization of the Goddess in 1991, and The Living Goddess in 1999. She claimed, in fact, that the temples of Malta and the numerous stone sculptures of goddesses are that of the goddess of regeneration. That means birth, death, and rebirth. In her study, she believed that in Malta and other parts of Europe, the Neolithic people worshipped the full cycle of birth, death, and rebirth in the form of a great goddess. The evidence that this is in her comparative study of numerous statuettes and their symbolical motifs that correspond with them. That is, not just in Malta, but comparative study of the Mediterranean basin. Now I wish to refer to the work of two other scholars who participated in this conference. The first one is Mimi Lobel from the United States. Her interesting paper was Ancient Religions in the Context of Cultural Types. A good part of her paper was focused on cross-cultural study of spatial archetypes in ancient architecture. Not only that, but also town planning, art, mythology, cosmology, social structures, which presented 6 models of cultures. Lobel elaborated on the archetype of the Great Round, originally labeled by Jungian psychologist Eric Newman. She asserted that the Great Round as a circular form was expressed in primitive architecture in stone circles. Thus, the spiritual focus was on the great goddess. Womb cavern, which was a prevalent form motif that became the prototype for the Holy of Holies of nearly all later religions. She continued to explain that the Great Round archetype was female-centered and matrilineal families were common in an egalitarian structure. The Maltese temples and rock-cut tombs are also examples of the Great Round cultures, where the great goddess was venerated. Another speaker in Malta, and the Malta Conference, was Giulia Battiti Sorlini, who delivered her talk about the megalithic temples of Malta using an anthropological perspective. She explained various hypotheses of a mother goddess, that is a mother goddess cult, associated with rituals related to symbolism of burial practices. She came up with different theories about fertility cult of the Neolithic indigenous people in Malta, giving significance of the return of the great mother goddess as a passage between life and death. In fact, Sorlini, here I have a long quote, but I will only read just an extract from it because otherwise I won't, I am so limited today. Assuming that a fertility cult seems from the belief in a mother goddess, seen not as an omnipotent figure about nature and man, but as a figure very much in tune with nature, its rhythmical changes, the cyclical processes, and symbolical passages between life and death, then it is possible to see death as a simple natural process. In this long statement, Sorlini is suggesting that there is no distinction between fertility cult, which existed in Malta in ancient times, and the mother goddess, who represented the cyclical aspects of life, death, and rebirth. The ancient Maltese, who believed in a mother goddess, accepted death as a natural process and was part of their value system. Now the question is, a mother goddess or other forms of deities? The interpretation of many figurines as the mother goddess found in the temples and burial places was discussed by other scholars. During the Malta Conference, that is in 1985, it's still debated today by many archaeologists who gave their own conflicting interpretations. Two British archaeologists, Caroline Malone and Simon Stoddart, do not agree that the hypothesis that a mother goddess existed in Malta and these figurines represent such a deity. They support their argument that the so-called female statuettes have no definition of gender and disagreed completely with other archaeologists like Maria Gimbutas, who claimed that these figurines represent mother goddess. She was the first to research and make a comparative study on goddess worshipping cultures of the Mediterranean region. Although Malone and Stoddart agree that certain figurines are female and they symbolize fertility, they rule out completely that the fat ladies, that's how they call them, or great goddesses, represent a female deity during the Neolithic period in Malta. The question of obese figures represent power, wealth, and fertility. It cannot be easily interpreted. So one may ask, what do these corpulent figures represent? If we take again the large, as you can see here, statuettes found at Tarshin temples, which is situated in a very prominent part of Malta, it is depicted, this statuette, you see on top, on the left, very large egg-shaped legs with a skirt to mid-calf. Unfortunately, only a fragment of this massive statue survived, so it must have been almost 3 meters high. Maria Gimbutas gave a different interpretation than just a deity representing fertility. I'm going to quote Gimbutas. Her calves are unnaturally thick, but her feet are tiny. There may be a symbolic meaning to this depiction. Perhaps they are eggs. If so, this would be more element in understanding the function of this goddess. She is not simply a fertility goddess, as she has been depicted until now, for her obesity has a deeper meaning, that of regeneration. She is specifically Maltese, a Maltese expression of the goddess of regeneration, end of quote. Maria Gimbutas, her assumption is that different rituals were held in Neolithic temples in Malta. The rites of death and regeneration were carried out in one part of the temple site, and the rites related to the celebrations of birth and regeneration of humans and nature were held in another area of the temples. Later on, you're going to see a plan of the temple, which I'll be referring. Here one must mention that most of the temples are divided in various sanctuaries. We call them sanctuaries. Each sanctuary has a number of apses, and in certain places also niches and other altars that were used for ceremonies and sacrifices. Later on, I will explain and discuss the idea put forward by a number of scholars who maintained that the actual shape of the temple is associated with that of the mother goddess. Going back to more interpretations by other academics who hold the most, that most of the statuettes represent Maltese goddess, we find American scholar Christina Biaggi, who dedicated a whole book on the existence of the goddess religion in Europe, giving a lot of importance to the temples of Malta and the island of the north of Scotland. Her book, very important book, called The Habitations of the Great Goddess, is a comprehensive study on the temples, on tombs, artifacts attributed to the female deity worshipped by prehistoric people. Biaggi's interpretation of the goddess figurines, both clothed and nude, is that clothed figures reflect rank and status, while nude figures were associated with magical power and sanctity. She stressed the idea that nude figurines in Malta could represent the goddess of generation. I quote Biaggi. The nude figures could represent the deity as the goddess of vegetation, the ensurer of fertility, fecundity, and generous harvests. Her obesity emphasizing her corpulence. These figurines could have evoked erotic, mystical emotions in both sexes in the Neolithic Maltese society, which was unencumbered by later patriarchal sexual codes that objectify and therefore preclude the mystical in the female body. End of quote. The ancient agriculturalists seem to have recognized the analogy between the start of vegetative life, that is germination, growth, and harvest, with the new life growing in the womb. Obesity symbolized also pregnancy and the beginning of life. Gimbutas suggested that a large quantity of pregnant goddess figurines have been found in European excavations. Therefore, it appears to be probable that the Maltese obese goddess statuettes represented the goddess of vegetation. Now we come to the body of the goddess. In her valuable study of Maltese figurines as represented as goddesses, Biaggi comments on different aspects of the goddess about her various positions and appearances. She refers to the theory by Gertrude Levi that the seated goddess inspired the building and the shape of the temples. Others maintain that the figures derived their shape from the temples. This assumption created great interest among prehistorians and for many seemed to be very acceptable. If we look at the plan, you're seeing it in front of you, we see that the Maltese Neolithic temples, like the one in Imnidra, we'll see it later, have the shape of the seated goddess on the right. Of course, the standing statuettes found at Hajar Im, one noticed the curvilinear structures are very similar. Another point that supports such evidence is that the early Maltese shrines in Malta were cave sanctuaries and also dug-up tombs, which had an egg-shaped form. These round-shaped structures of early tombs revealed later evolved as temples. The tomb was also related to the womb. We say today tomb womb or womb tomb. The womb that protected the fetus from external forces and promised birth, and the tomb where the dead were placed promised rebirth. Burial in the womb of the earth promised rebirth. According to the archaeological finds in Neolithic burial places in Malta, many skeletons were found in a fetal position. That is, the knees of the deceased were placed close to the chest. Traces of red ochre were also sprinkled on the body of the dead. This symbolized blood, blood that could also mean the preparation for rebirth. Later on, the tomb, with a round structure, evolved into a temple, with round apses arranged in the shape of a woman's body. So if we look at the diagram of the great goddess, characterized by abundant flesh on the arms, thighs, and buttocks, and the rounded structures of the temple, one could understand better the idea of the body of the great goddess or the great mother. Giulia Battiti Sorlini, in her paper The Megalithic Temples of Malta, an Anthropological Perspective, quotes Günther Zunz, who says that these temples reproduce in a fixed symbolic form the body of the Great Mother, as medieval churches reproduce the cross of Christ. You are seeing here the two examples. The main archaeologists who pondered on the idea that Malta's Neolithic temples have the shape of a mother goddess, is, of course, again, Maria Gimbutas. She claimed that I am going to quote her again, the origin of the temples of Malta are X-shaped underground tombs. Even during their apogee in the 4th century before Christ and during the beginning of the 3rd millennium, these were not formed like houses, as were those in Southern Europe, but were actually expressions of the regenerating body of the goddess, with an enormous X-shaped buttocks. This image is repeated numerously in stone sculptures of the goddess. Here we have another example of a tiny statuette with large buttocks, and over here we have Imnidra temples. In fact, Gimbutas repeatedly this hypothesis that some megalithic temples have the shape of the goddess and that their connectedness with the afterlife, that is rebirth, is so evident. Before she died, she wrote on this theme, and she maintains that the Maltese megalithic temples and the derivation of their shape, she supported her argument that the shape of the temples represented the actual shape of the goddess by mentioning the fact that it is found not only in Malta, but also in other parts of Europe. The shapes of the triangular shrines also symbolize the pubic triangle, vulva, and the uterus images as the places from where birth starts, corresponding to the abstract triangular images of the goddesses. These sacred places provided symbolical reflections on the cycle of life. Certain foreign scholars, probably because of Maria Gimbutas' publication, became interested in the Maltese goddess of Malta. One of them is the Dutch scholar and cultural anthropologist and art historian Veronica Wien. She and her husband, they came to Malta. Also, her husband is Adrian van der Bloem, spent some years in Malta researching about the early Maltese inhabitants and their temples and their culture. They also published some books, also papers in various learned journals about the theme related to Malta. In her book, The Goddess of Malta, the Lady of the Waters and the Earth, 1992, Veronica Wien discusses at length the assertion that the body of the goddess is also related to the temples. She saw great symbolical factors that were related to the religious life of the early inhabitants of Malta and the way the temples and statuettes were used for ritual purposes. The body of the goddess represented the temple, which was the place for transformation. Thrilling is the experience of, I am quoting Veronica Wien, thrilling is the experience of entering the goddess body through her vagina. Symbolically, there is nothing strange about this. Her dark womb is a place for transformation, after which one comes out reborn. For that matter, this is the very purpose of every, what it's called, rite de passage or rite de passage, or rite de passage. I don't know in English how it's translated, for which so many buildings have been erected through the ages, including our churches. However, in ancient Malta, all this has been expressed in a very literal manner. The trilithon, the entrance, consisting of 3 slabs of stone, in reality, it is entering the vagina of the goddess. Her theory that even the temple sites had to be built in a very particular place, while even today's churches are built in the center of a town or a village, towering above ordinary buildings, enchanted to look at and used at places of worship, the Neolithic temples were built looking across the fields, away from the village. From the temples, one looked across the fields, the goddess in the shape of a temple, supervising, that is, supervised fertility of the land, the progress of growth, the abundance of the harvest below her, needed for the people to live. Most followers of Maria Gimbutas continued to validate this hypothesis by showing that even in other cultures, epochs, and temples, a sacred place of worship always symbolized some form of a female deity. I just stated this. But not everybody, as I said earlier, agreed. For example, another British archaeologist, Ruth Whitehouse, who specialized in ritual, burials, and religion, also criticized the idea that many Neolithic figurines, including those of Malta, have a specific gender, and maintained that a mother goddess religion did not exist in Malta. By the way, I attended one of her lectures when she came to Malta at our university. In her lecture, this was the lecture, The Prehistoric Mother Goddess, Ancient Power or Modern Myth, which she delivered in 2001, she referred to the origin of the history of the mother goddess concept. This, she stated, originated in the 19th century, precisely in 1861. She emphasized that non-archaeologists maintained that the lost golden age of matriarchy was a great empowerment for women. Whitehouse mentioned Maria Gimbutas as the main exponent of the mother goddess theory, and that this was of great inspiration to what is called the goddess movement. She stated that this movement worked on the theory of matriarchy, and that Gimbutas, as well as feminist groups, supported this theory through different images of goddess statuettes, apart from myths, maintaining that the golden age was brought to an end by patriarchy, that is, Indo-European warfare. According to Gimbutas, the occurrence of the urbanization as well as the disappearance of goddess figurines were the result of patriarchal pastoralists, invaders from the Black Sea. Ruth Whitehouse continued to elaborate on this against this theory by showing that the various figurines were not necessarily goddesses and females. And she asserted that females had roles in the past. Not all figurines from prehistory that have been considered female show that they are clearly female. Her assertion was that although fertility rites were practiced, but not necessarily show that a mother goddess cult existed, finally, Whitehouse ended her lecture by saying, I quote her, because I wrote it down, I recorded, "It is clear that the idea of a mother goddess appeals to the female gender." And also she queried where these statuettes were sex objects. The question of matriarchy were also emerges from the existence of a mother goddess religion in Malta and the Neolithic period. Of course, there are different opinions whether this type of culture really existed or not. The fact that the Neolithic is frequently viewed as matriarchal or matrifocal, and that society lived peacefully and harmoniously without warfare, like societies that came after, contrasting with often violent and aggressive patriarchal societies, is an old debate. There were many scholars who dedicated a good part of their studies on this subject. The first, as you all know, or might know because you are on spirituality, the first influential writer about the theory of matriarchy is the Swiss social philosopher Johann Jacob Bachofen. His book, Myth, Religion, and Mother Right, is about ancient myth symbols and the worship of a female deity, focusing on the power of the mother. His matriarchy theory today seems to be outdated, but was well accepted by other great social theorists like Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud. Among other scholars who elaborated on this theory, we find the British historian and anthropologist James Fraser, whose exhaustive book, The Golden Bough, published in 1922, on world cultures, include the matriarchy theory. Many other archaeologists, prehistorians, anthropologists, and social philosophers, up to this very day, debated the theory of matriarchy and tried to come to some conclusions, but unfortunately, disagreement still exists. I'm not going to extend this debate of whether a matriarchal society existed, but my intention here is to present some kind of a holistic understanding that in Malta, a mother goddess religion was evident and that life was centered around the mother. Maria Gimbutas and her followers tried to show that this in their work, but unfortunately, certain archaeologists turned this hypothesis because they did not carry out serious research on myth and also symbolism and ritual. However, important, many questions, as you know, remain unanswered. Am I still in time, or because
Yes, that's fine.
Okay. Yeah, I referred to the Golden Bough as you all know, and many questions, they remained unanswered. The anatomical and aesthetic aspect is closer to the female form. As you know, physiological condition of ancient indigenous females, they suffered from what is called as statopegia. I think I need to skip some because otherwise, it's this sedentary characteristic which shows in a symbolical way that there is a close bond with the earth. Here you can see the idea, the ancient idea, the physiology of statopegia. Jungian analyst Eric Newman also explains that in the art of ancient cultures, statopegia is interpreted symbolically. He stated, it gives without saying that such a symbolic accentuation of the female, even when unconscious, may cause such female types to be favored and sometimes even cultivated. The Great Mother Goddess is at times represented sitting on the earth like some sort of a goddess statuette, as you can see here. That is the sleeping lady found at the Hypogeum, the underground burial temple. We call it sleeping lady, or there are many, the dreamer of Malta, there are many, they call it, and you know, this is about statopegia, as I explained. And again, I go back to Cristina Biaggi, that the Maltese figures seem to embody cosmic power and the overflowing fullness on the superhuman scale, which is beyond humanism. In fact, in one of my papers, I referred to that this dualism beyond the sexes, when the sculptor of that time was depicting a deity, the prehistoric, if you call them artists, we are not supposed, by the way, to call him artists, could be a magician or whatever, wanted to show the non-human element, the divinity aspect of the statuettes, by eliminating the gender, using stylized cannons, like the Egyptians used in their sculpture, and even the Romans, and so on. How is the time? I mean, what's how long left? Here,
Yeah, where, I mean, for how long do you think you, how long do you need in order to first, come to conclusions and?
I'm a bit far away for the conclusion, but I can go through, yeah, because this is probability is a 3-hour lecture, but it doesn't matter. Let me go through and then I will read my conclusion.
Yeah, okay.
The Neolithic founds at I referred to the sleeping lady or the dreamer of Malta earlier, found, you can see the underground burial place at Halsaflini in Paula, not far away from my house. It's about a 12-minute drive. Malta is full of these clusters of temples. Hajar-Im is perhaps one of the thrilling temples, where one could enter as if entering into the womb of the goddess. It's in the Zuri area, and southeast area. The corpulent bodies, these are the samples of the statuettes found at the Archaeology Museum. These were excavated at Hajar-Im. freestanding, some of them, and others are seated in position, the same shape of the temple, as you saw in the plan. Then there are many other statuettes, figurines. The Venus of Malta in the middle. She is evident as a female statuette. The standing ones, because the breasts are small, but the anatomical structure, the torso and the buttocks show that they are female. I don't think that they lack the male form. This is Tarshian temples where the giant statuette was found. Unfortunately, as I said earlier, only a part of the, they call it, scholars call it the fertility goddess or the fat ladies, but I disagree with that. Tarshian goddess, this is the plan of Tarshian goddess. Again, you have the shape of the goddess. There are other statuettes. For example, a small clay statuette, which looks grotesque, is a female figure showing the crucial moment of birth, expressing a sense of gesture and, touching her head, of course, broken raised legs, suggesting that the person, the woman is in labor. Here there is a statue of a priestess. Whether it's a male or a female, we don't know. But the rendering of the hair and the form of her wig, it gives the idea that there was some form of ritual which secures that hypothesis. Another similar sculpture of the giantess, 1964, was found by a group of Italian archaeologists at SASIG, again, not far away from here, about 20 minutes, it's near the seaside, has small hefty feet like the earlier one of Tarshian, but unfortunately it is heavily damaged. So we cannot identify the gender. The stylized, as Maria Gimbutas referred to, the characteristics of the vulva is there, and there is a comparative study on this, anatomical, peculiar, okay, but the incised vulva is there in both cases, the one of Malta and the other one, which is Danubian or Cycladic. The last underground temple, which is close to the Gigantia one I referred to before the lecture, the Sharastone Circle, where many statuettes were excavated from there. It's about, 500 meters from Gigantia temples, this underground burial place. These statuettes, these marvelous statuettes, were excavated. A group of them is called the Shaman's Bundle on the left. Very stylized. You have even the shape of the dog, the child crawling, the double goddess or twin fat ladies, and the obese statuette, which is just a 7-centimeter high statuette with a very mysterious expression. Cult, fertility ritual and burial. There were others who wrote about this. John Evans was one of the pioneers of British archaeologists. We were under British colony, and he kept, before he passed away, he kept writing about this. This is a 1996 that he came to an agreement that the inhabitants of Malta venerated some kind of divinity, referred to the colossal statuette and subordinate figures found at Tarshian temples. This is the Tarshian temples one, again, goddess of fertility. There are other statues and carvings on the temple sites. The phallic representations of fertility is evident. Relief of bulls and sow piglets is shown that fertility is there continuously. We are saying here 4,000, ranging from 2,500 to 4,000 years before Christ. And the Venus figurine I referred to earlier, admitting that it is a realistic, very realistic figure of a female person. Ardalam and Skorba temples take us back much earlier. These are just the ruins, are still there. And Ardalam, which is an underground cave, where you can find stalactites and stalagmites there. The prehistoric peoples in Malta were very preoccupied with the propagation of life, because the island's geographical isolation and cult and religious fervor attained great intensity. The goddess is now identified as the mother goddess, exemplifying Mother Earth. As I have already stated, some of the earlier communities who learned how to work the land established a fertility cult to the greatness that the earth gave to men. Yes, I refer to Richard England. Sometimes I meet Richard, he's in his 80s now, and he besides, he is of world repute as an architect. He wrote about the history of architecture in Malta, as well as he designed our universities, particularly was designed by this great architect. It's, you know, let me say a few words about Richard England. Otherwise, yes. During the, I'm going to say this is very important for you. During the Neolithic period, a deity representing Mother Earth as a mother goddess seemed possible. The idea of a male goddess was not yet conceived. Many sustain that the first deities were feminine. The goddess was believed to have created the universal and represented all aspects of creativity. One also has to consider that the goddess is an archetypal symbol found at work within the human psyche. Therefore, the urge to create a symbol of a universal female deity that expressed all manifestations related to the beginning and the end of life and regeneration, that means rebirth, was a strong possibility that Cristina Biaggi, Sorlini, Maria Gimbutas, they also referred to this. Richard England emphasized that the beginning of setting up of a deity or some kind of divinity related to the mother goddess was meant as Mother Earth. We cannot separate them. And he wrote this: having learned to husband the earth, the early inhabitants, especially a fertility cult, a relationship of productive earth to women, were established in setting up of a deity or divinity of fecundity, proclaimed as Mother Goddess. The goddess, in their belief, became not only the personification of Earth, but also the archetypal image symbol of the whole human psyche. The relationship between seeds, death, placed underground within Mother Earth, returning through regeneration in different forms, crops, life, and men entering the body space of the goddess to emerge reborn on exit was not a difficult equation for those people to put into meaning and context. These are the words of Richard England. I am going to conclude. How are we in time? What's the time there? Because here it's 8:15, so over there is...
Yeah, I mean, we can conclude, it's fine. I mean, if
Yeah,
you want.
the change
Yeah,
of the hour, I get that. Okay, let's so
it's fine. I mean,
so that we can have questions and we can discuss more on this.
yeah.
Yeah, I believe a lot on this, the archetypal symbol of the goddess. We must understand that art and religion was basically the same during the prehistoric period. But before, these are other statuettes found, as you see, the Venus of Willendorf, the Venus of Lespune, the Vignano Venus, the Anatolian figures, Sat al-Hayuk, and the Nile goddess here. They are the studies of Maria Gimbutas. Yes, a work of art in ancient times, whether a sculpture or a painting, that is the actual art object, contained magic, a kind of psychic energy. The prehistoric art of the Maltese temples is primitive and magical and suggests that the idols and symbols were used to enhance the religious cults of the time. Art thus became highly symbolical and was an important aspect in the life of prehistoric people. Some prehistoric archetypal symbols began to appear in caves, burial, hypogea, and temples. Statues and statuettes were abandoned, and in many Neolithic temples in Malta, and their representations, which are apart from their beauty, their main purpose was to satisfy the religious needs of the time. It was also an attempt to interact with the universe. One may conclude that from the discussion about whether a mother goddess or another form of deity existed in prehistoric past, the temples certainly served as sites for the activities of fertility cults. Today, the debates still in progress, especially as regards to the interpretation of the statues and statuettes. It seems that the mainstream traditional archaeologists find it hard to conclude that the repetitive and similarity of the statuettes and statues were corpulent bodies and pleated skirts, repeated, and not just one, but many, are attributed to a singular mother goddess or a great goddess. On the other hand, other scholars who are more open to various interpretations of these figurines find that there must have been some connection with a fertility goddess or earth goddess. I am ending this paper with the words by Jungian psychologist Eric Newman when proclaiming that the mother goddess or the great mother is a primordial image within the human psyche. He stated this, I quote Newman, the great mother, the great earth mother who brings forth all life from is eminently the mother of all vegetation. The fertility rituals and myths of the whole world are based upon this archetypal context. End of quote. For him, this is a Neolithic event, with the Stone Age sculptors of the Great Mother as a goddess, the archetypal feminine suddenly burst open the world of man in overwhelming and perfection. Aside from the cave paintings, these figures of the great goddesses are the earliest cults and works of art known to us. Yeah, I ended this.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, we can.
Yes, we can now open the platform for the discussion. So maybe if you could please remove the PowerPoint presentation.
I will. And I have to stop sharing, that is. Is it okay?
No, you need to close it down. You just need to click on the X because we can still see your computer.
Okay.
On screen.
So
just yeah.
Stop share. Okay.
Yeah.
Fine.
Okay.
Yes. So I am open to questions. Yes.
So who wants to start? I can start if you want. I mean,
yes.
I was going to ask
okay.
One thing. When I was in Malta, the Virgin Mary in the Christian tradition is obviously extremely important. How far do you think that the goddess traditions of that period were all rolled into the Virgin Mary, who similarly is the guardian of life and death, and we have the Ave Maria, which is sung at death as being and so on. So how far do you think that the strong devotion to the Virgin Mary, which is considerable, whatever the goddess tradition was, it got rolled into her?
Yes. Scholar from New Zealand, I met her a couple of times because also her husband is Maltese, but she lectures at Massey University in New Zealand. She wrote extensively about what you're saying, that the Virgin Mary and the connection with the ancient female goddess. She has an essay on this. If you Google Catherine Rowntree, her name, Catherine Rowntree wrote about this subject. That even it's in the DNA of the Maltese, inherited. So I think Catherine Rowntree is right on this.
Yes, I mean the powerful Irish book in that one was the book called The Serpent and the Goddess, where in Ireland it was found that she suggested that all the names of the Virgin Mary are related to the various female aspects: the goddess of the sea, the goddess of the stars, the goddess of Mary of the stars, Mary of the sea, Mary they all drew on those traditions, in a sense. What I find fascinating about that relationship, which I believe is right, is that the Virgin Mary lost those massive breasts and hips. The book I shall never write, that I always want to write, is When the Goddess Went on a Diet.
But as I stated earlier, and some other scholars wrote about this, that I refer to it, in fact, that at that time, pregnancy and vegetation and the cultivating of the land were homogeneous, were one thing. They were not separated. So cultivating I agree totally with Richard England, that the architect, that it starts from there, and the corpulent bodies suggest that.
But you do see the same shape in other cultures. That, I mean, the notion of the thin woman's body, which is the contemporary, is of course a relatively recent invention. And in other cultures, it's the fat woman's body, which we now call obese, which was seen to be desirable and acceptable, and so on. So I think there's a whole interesting ball game there. I mean, when one I go to South Africa regularly, you see the embracing of the much larger female body. I see in schools a huge conflict. Indeed, it causes, and I've seen it in my experience, bulimia, the conflict between the African view of the body, or the Caribbean view of the body, and the white doctor's view of the body. And the child gets confused by two images of the female, which don't fit together at all.
Yeah, you're right. I agree totally with you. Even modern fashion, which brought
Absolutely.
the situation. Yeah. We had to look at the images, early photographs of women. They were not like today. I mean, it's the evolution of the female as we see today. But you can, maybe about this subject, you are more versed than me.
Well, I love the idea that my grandmother's clothes, when I had them, always included a bustle. So you had to make the bottom bigger in some way. And it's only very recently that the notion of a small bottom has become acceptable, rather than the notion of extending that in some way, which you see in those figures, the extension of the bottom, which links the female body with the earth. But I think when you look at what's going on, of course, there's a huge rediscovery of all of that, and an embracing of those figures. If you accept the fact that, which you clearly do, that there was that matriarchal society, we're now busy rediscovering it and trying to sit on the earth again.
Yes, yes. It's I mean, even David Trump, a British archaeologist, refers to the functionality of the temples. You cannot separate the temples from the artifacts which were
no. Any more than you can separate the Christian tradition from its artifacts. It's exactly the same. Interestingly, I heard a story the other day from somebody doing ecology, that the early farmers used to sit actually bare-bottomed on the earth to decide when to plant the seeds, because they needed to know what the temperature was and to feel the earth. So that was a way of working what the best of sowing time was, because you could feel the temperature of the earth and feel whether it was ready. And that was still in the sort of consciousness of some farmers as to how you found it. So I think there's a lot of evidence to support that notion of the body and the earth. And of course, what Christianity did was to disembody a lot of it, really.
Yes. Yeah.
I think it's interesting to see what Judith wrote. I mean, about Kim Kardashian. Sorry if I don't pronounce it well. I don't follow her. Just not find it very interesting. But still, I mean, it is actually fashionable now, and lots of the breast enlargement and the bottom enlargement,
Exactly.
and which is extreme. It's extreme, and I think it's a probably it's a statement, because it looks so strange, because it looks so well, like, it's very difficult. It's almost because the body is thin, and at the same time there are these parts which are enlarged, but
Not
there
just
is
the
a certain
breast.
psyche.
Yeah. Not
Yeah, but there is some kind of not the breast. The breast has to be
maybe the
enlarged, and the
bottom as
bottom is
well.
being
Yeah.
enlarged now as well, with all these
Exactly.
injections of fat. Interesting, in terms of the psyche, the need to do it, the need to return to these images. So that could be, well, it's something that happens now. So
Well,
it's I believe that what you just said, it's about a psychic pattern. It's so deeply rooted, that it's part of our humanity. It's like inseparable
I
from
mean,
who we are.
I loved
Uh,
my visit to Malta. I went to Malta when I was in my 50s, and I'd been brought up in a Christian tradition from all of my life, although I hadn't embraced it all the time. And I can remember when I first saw the statues, and my initial response was, this is the first time I have seen an image of the divine that looks remotely like me. I mean, what 50 years of devotion to a religion, and there was never an image of the divine that looked like me. So I embrace Malta with the depth of my heart, because those images transformed my current life. I mean, I'm not an archaeologist. I'm a Christian priest, in fact, although I may not sound like one. But that notion that in Christianity, women have been deprived of any images, any art, in fact, any symbol, either sculptural or visual, which represents the divine as them. And when people attempt it, just like you have explained with the archaeologists, they are attacked for representing it in that way. I mean, the most striking picture was an image of the vagina with a cross in it. And that was, considered the most heretical image that could possibly have been done. And yet, as you look at those images, particularly the one of the woman in childbirth, you can see them. So even though you're an archaeologist and you're looking at it as the past, they have a profound influence, I think, on the present. So thank you for showing us the scholar, the scholarly looking at it. But it's not only about the past, it's profoundly about the present.
Present, yeah, I agree, and thank you. Yes.
What I find very interesting is that it's the similarity of the sleeping lady, or the sleeping goddess, or the dreamer, to Henry Moore's
Sculpture.
sculpture. It's almost like, I'm curious to know whether this was his source of
Yes.
inspiration, because it's very similar. These figurines are very similar to his sculptures, and I know that Eric Neumann wrote a book about him. I read it, but I this is the first time where I've seen the source, that it could be there. Do you
Yes,
know
yes,
anything?
yes. Henry Moore is one of I'm going to put it that way, the first primitivists of modern sculpture. And his work is also derived from primitive sources. That is, he studied primitive art and prehistoric art, and that's how his art, his creativity burst later. in his life.
But
Yeah,
isn't
but I was the abstract quality of those sculptures. This is something that
Oh,
I
yes, yes, yes.
suddenly, yeah. I mean, their ability to conceptualize the image through art, through sculpture in an abstract way, is fascinating. And it was, for me, it was like a revisiting idea that you managed to bring to us, and it's sort of coming alive, and I kind of see it very clearly now. Yes, thank you.
It's the idea of simplicity of these statuettes, eliminating detail, although the Venus of Malta has large breasts and the form is very feminine. It is a female, nobody can deny it, although it is headless, because there is another story about the headless, because there are hypotheses that heads were changed during the seasons. Different heads were placed on the bodies of these corpulent figures to represent a season, the changing of the year. So yes, they eliminated details, and that is where this simplicity was so influential on modern artists like Henry Moore and others.
Yes.
But isn't it sad that the word primitivist becomes used? I mean, the very designation is in a sense condemnatory, and the notion of progress and moving from that to something better is, I think, been a disaster. Because you know that linear progress, that the move to the male form of the divine was somehow or other progress. I mean, it's been a disaster for both theology and for women, really, and that it's much easier. I know, as you rightly say, the circular image is actually a better one for the way in which life works, in that one thing doesn't follow another. We go around in a circle and emphasize different things. And you're right, what we still have, of course, are baptistries, which are in general circular. If you look at, say, Florence, if you have separate baptistries, those are circular, where the church is much more across. So you've retained the circle in the Christian tradition by having the baptistry associated with birth as a circle still. So the remains of it is there.
Yeah, the primitivism aspect, there is a great book by two American scholars, Lovejoy and Boas. Before the war, they started to write. I have their first book. Unfortunately, after the war, they did not continue. The second volume was The History of Primitivism. And they mention this, what you're saying. It's a great book. I think it's the history of primitivism and related ideas. They start before the Greeks. They go back to primitive times, and they mention the idea, the concept of the soft primitivists and the hard primitivists, the contrasts, that the hard primitivists, they had to work the fields, unlike the soft primitivists, where they found a paradise and they pick up the fruit from the trees and they survive. You know, it's all there.
But
there is a question.
There were feminist scholars in the late 19th century which were describing Western imperialism as destroying these matriarchal societies. As the early American feminist theorists were saying that the Western people came in their boats and literally destroyed. I'm interested you say that the head slots on, because I assume that the heads were cut off, but the notion of slotting different heads on, I think is a really interesting one.
Yeah, because there is a hole in the neck.
That's right.
Yeah,
they slot it in, that's right.
The probability was that the head was made of wood or another stone placed there and held there for a temporary period.
And that's still done in the southern France to the Black Madonna. She's redressed for the winters, and of course done in the Goddess Temple in Glastonbury, where she is redressed for every season. So that notion is still there, where the goddess traditions are still there. So it's that Les Trois Saintes Maries de la Mer, where you've got the Black Madonna who is redressed by the gypsies every year.
Yes.
There is a question here from
Judith.
Judith for you. And she asked if you have any comments about the Knights of Malta in Masonic tradition and the female goddess.
That's it's not easy to answer that question. Remember that excavations of our prehistory did not start during the times of the Knights. There is a great probability that Malta was the point in the Mediterranean before the Mediterranean submerged, and we were there are Maltese scholars who identify that Malta was the point of Atlantis. So we can pose the question, why in Malta, in such a small area, surface area, there are so many temples? There are about 64 temples in Malta, the remains. 7 of them are in good condition. So that question gives an idea that was Malta a place where seafarers passed by and or stop here to thank the gods or the goddess? We don't know. But then that was all lost with the coming of the Phoenicians and the Arabs, and then later on the Knights. So the excavations, they only go to about 150 years. So, you know, and there are still, we still find archaeological sites, especially when they are excavating to build somewhere.
I mean, interesting comparison would be with Lourdes and the number of statues of the Virgin, which are sold at Lourdes and people are taking all over Europe. And maybe there was a similar, you have those statues which people were using, as you suggest, as devotional objects, taking to their homes, bringing to the temple, getting them blessed, just like the pilgrims at Lourdes are doing, you know, taking endless statues of the Virgin Mary with them.
Yeah, it's quite good. Yeah, so with the Knights, it's the lost period, I call it, where you know, the Knights started to build our fortifications, good part of the harbor area, of the fortifications of the harbor area, because of the Turkish invasions. We had to, you know, we lost underground some good areas where there might have been some temples there. So, say Tarshin temples were excavated while one of the farmers was digging a hole for a cistern, and everything dropped, and he found himself inside the temple. You know, that's how they discovered them. Not archaeologists, but they were building, and so who knows, during the nights when they found big boulders of stone and they eliminated them, and at that time there was no interest in antiquity, in ancient times.
I think it's an interesting one because in a completely different culture, there's a movement that says that even in the temple in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus, there was still the cult of the goddesses Asherah and so on, and that Salome and Mary Magdalene and all of those were all involved in that. So you had a curious situation of a male god and a female god coexisting in the temple at that time.
Yes, I said earlier, before the concept of God came about,
Yes,
it's the earth giving the fecundity powers, and it's all there. And then the Romans started to change, because even the Greeks, if you study Greek history, there we come across Greek goddesses. I wish to quote, even for today, it's still very relevant, a sentence which, unfortunately, the Pope, who only lived for 30 days, Pope Paul John I, he said, God is a father, God is the son, but God is also the mother.
absolutely. Well, a lot of feminist theology, that's where they are, that the Trinity was simply a skewing of father, mother, child. So that was its original. And then you have the Holy Spirit as being feminine. So you have the Father, the feminine, and the child. So, and there's a lot of sense of making that, of restoring that theology, even within a sort of Christian frame. But you also have, of course, I'm writing them, hymns about the earth, redeeming the earth, and redeeming, one of the hymns I've written is Sing a Song of Whirling Worms. So looking at the work of the earth and getting away from the abstract notion of the heavens, and restoring the materiality of the earth into the concept of the divine, which we see in Hildegard of Bingen's images. Hildegard of Bingen, you see the world as the body of God. So her visions show a similar image, a large God with a huge body with human beings and vegetation inside it. And her hymn to the Virgin, O Viridissima Virgo, says that in you, she's talking in this sense of the Virgin Mary, trees spring up and balsam is born and so on. So the Virgin Mary becomes, she's called the Viridissima Virgo, the most greening branch. So she is a greening branch. So you still have within the Christian frame the notion of the Virgin Mary as a flourishing branch.
Yeah, you can put it that way as well. Yeah.
Mm. So it sort of lives on in a very curious way.
Yeah. More questions?
Well, I don't know if it's a question, it's a question or a comment. It's about what you said about the relationship between art and religion, or art and, and sacred.
Yeah.
That it was one thing, it was, and that's this is something that modern history, there's this separation from it. And we started this group in a way in order to explore the relationship between the art and the spiritual. So in a way, we are trying, we're trying to understand those links and find artists who are interested in this relationship, in these relationships, because what you showed is so beautiful, it's so natural. I mean, the temples, it just make me feel I don't know, I feel sort of the longing, to the earth, and this separation in the way we live, in the West. It's we're so apart from, well, not everyone, but most of the people who are in urban environments have this vision, and so there's this,
I think well, that was particularly what you're saying, Leela, was brought home to me actually in Australia, where I was in the museum in Canberra, and there was a fish, and the detail of who found the fish and which people it had been taken from, and so there were all these details beautifully tabulated. But then at the end, the last bit said, this fish was the god of these people, and when the lake was short of fish, they ran their hand along the fish, and then they put their hand into the lake, and the lake was refilled with fish. Now, when the Western people took it, they took it as if it was a Van Gogh, but actually, in their concept of art, they were taking much, much more than a Van Gogh. They were taking away the very essence of the divine of the people. And suddenly the two views of art, you could see what it wasn't, not only was it stolen, but it also stole a concept. And I can remember an Aboriginal young man bowling into the art gallery in a beautiful exhibition of Aboriginal and Western art there, saying, why have we allowed our art to be to be accommodated in this European style? This is, our art is sacred. It should not be put in galleries. It is part of our ritual. And, you know, fortunately he was allowed to speak, but it was an impassioned view of the notion of putting art in galleries was against everything that it stood for in Aboriginal culture.
Yes, yes.
Yes,
yes, it is against, because there is a lot of there is a communication with the spirits, and it's not yeah. I mean, it's sacred, and it's not. It's also when the spirits are involved. The concept of the making of the art is the making of the arts together with the spirits. So
sometimes we make a mistake to say art. It's material culture. The concept of art. The concept of art. We use art for that particular. Even the word artist. At that time, there were no artists, but there were magicians or whatever, shamans and people who had particular power in the community, in the society, and they produced these images, which today we call them art, but for them it wasn't the art that we put in our on the sofa in our sitting room, but or in the museum, but it's a deeper meaning to them, more than our art we know today.
Well, it's
yeah, well,
true. It's equally true of drama. I mean, drama and music. All ritual was drama and music, and all drama and music was ritual. There was no distinction between them at all. There were no theaters. The theaters were temples. So if you went to the temple of Asclepius, the first thing you did was to see a play, because that was regarded as the worship and understanding. So this separation of spirituality from the arts in general, not only the visual arts, but the music and drama, has been a profound shift. And that would have been true in the ancient Greek culture. In a sense, it becomes separated much more clearly at the so-called Enlightenment, which I prefer to see as the Endarkenment.
But you know that there is some research, and I'm sorry, I can't remember all this information. I mean, but there is some research on cave art and sort of anthropology that and that is sort of explaining, or there is a theory that well, the hierarchy, the social hierarchy of the shaman, the priests, the artists, and the community was formed during those early eras, and some people had, or few people in the community, which was very small, had the capacity to see beyond, and they were able to paint. Not everybody was painting,
Wow.
and then they would take the people to experience um, a certain rite of passage or whatever it was, you know. Now, well, it's a theory, but it's actually quite a well, it's been researched properly.
Yes.
So, uh, well, it may be, but you know, there is also a theory that you can't, although they were not artists the way we see them, the beauty, the attention to beauty, to the aesthetics. Um, I think it's evidence of some kind of an aesthetic uh, taste or style, or it's as if there is a, you know, they're not just making an artifact, they are decorating it, they
Yeah.
you know, they invest
And
in it. So I think we see the birth of sort of art and design in a way, but it's still part of a spiritual and religious
I
ritual. And
I I particularly like Ellen de Senayake explanation of or definition of art. Do you know her?
yes, yes.
Yeah. So she calls art a behavior rather than a concept.
Of course. Yeah.
So because she's coming from an ethological perspective, so she's looking at humans as a species rather than, you know, something special. And so species are defined by behaviors, and art is very specific to humans as a behavior in the animal kingdom. And so she approaches art as a specific human behavior, and she basically defines it as making special, artification. So the behavior, she calls this behavior artification, which is the art, it's the art of making an object, a mundane object, special. So something that has been taken apart from the profane, and therefore by doing that, and this is my interpretation, you sacralize the object.
Certainly.
And so it becomes sacred. And as a sacred object is also magical, particularly in the Neolithical times, but not even, I mean, even in African cultures or indigenous cultures.
Other cultures, yes.
Yeah, objects that were used in rituals were intrinsically magic. They had they have power, but funnily enough, when the ritual is over, they can be disposed of. It's not like our art that, you know, we put in a museum forever.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, what you said, yes, I agree, because even, for example, when we look at Mark Rothko, for example, his abstract paintings are spiritual, and many times he repeated that why do people cry in front of my paintings? And his paintings, most of his paintings are just color, you know, shade on shade.
oh yeah.
So the spiritual aspect is intriguing there, and it's then up to the person who accepts that which is something spiritual. It's objectifying that object into something sacred. We do this today in everyday culture, that an object would become relevant if one gives some form of interpretation to that object. It happens in contemporary art every day.
But in Rothko example, I am very careful about his claims of his paintings carrying some sort of emotional significance, because there is a particular type of synesthesia whereby colors are associated to emotions. And so some people, when they see certain colors, those colors bring up certain emotions. So it's a rare kind of synesthesia, but it does exist. To me, for example, they do nothing. I mean, I look at them and I look at them and I look at them, nothing. So
Yes,
it's a very subjective experience.
Yeah.
It's irrational. It's not rational. You know, you can't explain it. So
Yeah. Same thing with the temples. Why do we get Americans here on pilgrimages, and when they enter into the temple, they have that experience in the temple, they sort of sense that kind of spirituality, the mother and daughter, to relieve the tensions, the traumatic tensions between them. They come specifically for that reason. As if somebody enters into a church and doesn't feel anything. It's the same thing with our temples. It's a psychological question as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I think yeah, I mean it's so interesting. It's a fascinating conversation. Do you still so are there any questions or comments from you? Yeah, because if there are no more, so yeah, Sean, I can't hear. Yeah.
I just want to say thanks for a really interesting presentation, and like all the questions kind of answered what I was thinking myself anyway, but it's just so fascinating, and I always love to see all the different little figurines, you know, with the large hips and the I just think it's so fascinating. The first time I ever saw one of those, or the first time I was ever introduced to that, was in Jean Owl's Earth Children series, where she wrote about that. So it's just really, really interesting. And thank you. Thanks for the talk.
Thank you.